Good evening. Tonight, we're going to a royal wedding. But not just any royal wedding. This one cost a small kingdom's annual grain reserves, used up 3 generations of lace, and involved over 400 official guests, not including the ones who had to sleep in the barn. A wedding so lavish, so carefully choreographed, and so diplomatically essential, that no one thought to ask if the bride was happy. Or, for that matter, who she really was. Before we begin, I have just a small favor to ask. If you enjoy gentle stories like this, and if you'd like to have more slow, soothing journeys through time to help you unwind, please take a moment to like this video, and follow the channel. That way, whenever you need a quiet companion to help you sleep, you'll know exactly where to find us. Her name was Iselda. Or Iseline. Or possibly Ilsa. It rather depends on who you ask, and whether they were invited to the wedding. The scribes from Montreve wrote Iselda. The Norwald court preferred Iseline. A few of the servants just called her the quiet one. And somewhere, on a now crumbling piece of vellum, there's a wedding record that lists her simply as the Lady of the West. She was 17 when she was promised. Not betrothed. Not courted. Promised, like a plot of land. Like a chest of silver. She was born in the Highland Duchy of Montreve, tucked in the valleys where the river forks like a broken wishbone, somewhere along the crumpled borderlands that, today, are probably just a forgotten corner between France and Savoy. The air there smells like moss and apple bark. The winters come early, and the roads turn to stone and ice by mid-October. She liked to walk alone along the southern wall of the estate, where the birds gathered near the almond trees. She liked the silence. Her father, Duke Raoul, liked grain shipments and border security. And when King Edric of Norwald sent an offer sealed with a wax crest and flanked by 2 ambassadors in imported fur, the decision was already made. The House of Montreve would trade one daughter for 30 years of peace and guaranteed access to the eastern grain routes. A fair deal, the nobles said. Very strategic. The prince, Aldric of Norwald, was not unkind. He was 24, with a thin mouth and a sharper nose, and a polite but persistent tendency to speak in formal proverbs. He had been raised for ceremony, not leadership. And yet, he had recently become heir when his older brother, the beloved Edric II, died in a suspiciously unfortunate hunting accident involving 3 dogs, 1 boar, and no witnesses. There were whispers, of course. There always are. But by the time Aldric appeared in the Montreve court, draped in blue velvet and flanked by foreign advisors, the official portrait was already being painted. He was now the future king. And Iselda, the new queen-in-waiting. They met once, briefly. She was given a dress 3 shades too bright and instructed to smile but not speak. He offered her a hawthorn blossom, which she held for the rest of the visit and quietly pressed between 2 pages of a prayer book when he left. No one told her what to do with it. She never asked for this match. But then again, no one asked her. By the time the first invitations were sent, her name was already misspelled in 3 counties. And yet, everything, the tapestries, the coin engraving, the stitched banners, bore that same misspelled name, copied from a single letter drafted by a secretary who'd never even met her. In Norwald, they prepared for a queen. In Montreve, they packed her trunk. And Iselda, or Iseline, or Ilsa, sat very still while her maid combed the pins from her hair and whispered, "You'll be all right. Just smile." The wedding was planned with military precision. There were committees, actual committees, for falconry placement, wine storage, horse grooming rotations, and acceptable embroidery patterns for cousin-tier guests. One noblewoman was assigned the full-time task of ensuring the napkins matched the house banners, even though no one could actually agree on whether Montreve's emblem was a silver fern or a dove with questionable proportions. Iselda was consulted on none of it. In theory, she was the central figure. The bride. The symbol of peace between 2 lands. In practice, she became a sort of paper doll, pinned inside the center of a moving mechanism far too large to stop. The archbishop selected the readings. The heralds rehearsed the sequence of trumpets. Now I'll tell you how an entire kingdom's budget could be spent on a woman who wasn't allowed to speak at her own party. The first step in preparing for a royal wedding was not love, or joy, or even writing down the bride's name correctly. It was the menu. Because nothing says sacred political alliance like stuffing a swan with another swan, then covering it in gold leaf and pretending it makes sense. Planning the feast took 6 months. That's 2 months longer than it took to negotiate the grain treaty the wedding was meant to celebrate. Every dish had to be approved by someone more important than the person actually cooking it. And most of it had to be imported from somewhere far enough to feel impressive. If it couldn't travel over 800 miles without rotting, was it even royal? Fish arrived from 5 different regions. Some of it salted. Some smoked. Some, inexplicably, still alive. They stored carp in the castle moat for days just so the cooks could say it had been cleansed by fresh royal water. Which is a poetic way of saying, moat fish. They served moat fish. There were negotiations over the type of salt. Montreve preferred sea salt. Norwald insisted on their noble rock salt from the king's own mines. The final agreement included a clause specifying the source of the salt. Modern prenups don't get that level of detail. The dishes themselves were designed to display wealth more than taste. Sugar sculptures of angels, because what dessert doesn't need theology? Pies that looked like castles but tasted like damp flour. Almond paste molded into doves, boars, and, reportedly, one extremely unfortunate interpretation of a lion. And a diplomatic jelly dyed in both house colors, which turned an alarming shade of gray. The bride was asked, once, if she had any favorite foods. She said she liked honeyed oats. The court cook smiled, bowed, and went back to deboning peacocks. If you've ever tried to plan a wedding with 2 families who hate each other and 3 separate Pinterest boards, welcome to Norwald, 1346. The castle was transformed into a diplomatic funhouse. Banners, garlands, rushes scattered across the floor. Draped linen to soften the echo of stone, because acoustics affect morale. One nobleman insisted the flowers face east to honor the sunrise. Another claimed that was sacrilegious. In the end, the flower garlands were hung sideways. Everyone agreed that felt fair. The bride's house colors were pale green and ivory. The groom's were navy and gold. Which, when combined by underpaid decorators in a cold stone hall, resulted in mustard. Everything came out vaguely mustard-colored. Even the bread looked confused. A temporary banquet hall was built, out of actual trees, because the main hall wasn't big enough for the guest list. It swayed slightly in the wind and was not unsafe, just atmospheric. One diplomat described it as charmingly unstable, which also described the seating chart. The castle staff, previously responsible for things like security and illness prevention, were reassigned to chair placement and curtain symmetry. One knight was put in charge of table linen continuity. He wept. And in the midst of it all, Iselda stood in a borrowed chamber with half-sewn tapestries on the wall, listening to servants argue about whether doves or partridges better represented fertility. Spoiler, she didn't care. Spoiler, it was partridges. The doves escaped. Let's talk about royal wedding roles. And how someone can be the main character but doesn't even belong to the group chat. Modern brides get spreadsheets. Dress fittings. Tasting cake sessions booked like a big event itself. Iselda got a list of banned facial expressions. Her job was to walk slowly, smile without teeth, and make sure her accent didn't leak through when she said unity. She was coached on posture for 3 hours. She was told not to blink too much during the ring exchange. She was not told who half the guests were, or why there was a goat in the scribe's chamber. That was not her concern. She asked once if she could see the guest list. They showed her the banner designs instead. Prince Aldrich was technically involved, mostly in the way that a reluctant CEO signs off on budget decisions he doesn't understand. He requested that the Ravon delegation be seated far from the wine merchants, long story. He also asked for less dancing this time, which raises several questions about previous weddings. When asked how he felt about the bride, he reportedly said, "She seems very decorous." He meant it as a compliment. The only thing either of them were allowed to choose was their cloak lining. And even then, Iselda's was changed at the last minute to better match the archway. So while the decorators argued about whether rosemary meant loyalty or death, and the cooks melted down 3 candlesticks to plate the custard more dramatically, Iselda practiced walking across the cold stone floor, imagining how it would feel to be seen. But not remembered. She would not choose the music or the menu. She would not be introduced in her own tongue. She would become part of the architecture. And everyone would clap. Now we get to the Great Barn Migration of 1346, and other luxuries of royal hospitality. By the time the guests began to arrive at Norwald Castle, the bride was already tired. Not from the festivities, those hadn't even started yet, but from the rehearsals, fittings, curtsies, the endless hours of waiting in rooms where other people were making decisions about her future. She had learned, over time, that the key to surviving royal preparations was not to ask questions. If you looked confused, someone would scold you. If you looked interested, someone would assign you a task. And if you looked anything resembling tired or bored, someone would whisper to the steward that you needed more rosewater to fix your complexion. So she stayed silent. And outside her chamber walls, the country began to arrive. The problem with royal weddings in the Middle Ages, and there were many, depending on your role, was that once an event was declared open to all houses of honor, no one had the courage to define what that meant. Was a cousin of a knight considered noble enough? What about a minor baron from a disputed borderland, whose title existed only in his own mind and a family crest drawn on the back of a wine jug? Royal events weren't just celebrations, they were political theater. Being seen at one meant you mattered. Being left out meant suspicion, insult, or worse, irrelevance. And so, to be safe, people simply showed up. By cart, by carriage, by mule. Some walked entire days through rain and mud with nothing but a family seal, a hopeful invitation, and an exaggerated sense of self-importance. One man reportedly introduced himself as ambassador of the southern vineyards, which turned out to be his cousin's backyard. In theory, Norwald Castle could hold up to 200 people. In practice, this meant stuffing knights into servant chambers, turning the scribe's library into a bunk room, and repurposing the treasury corridor into what one steward delicately referred to as a sleeping salon for heavily perfumed visitors. And still, the guests kept arriving. Eventually, there was only one option left: the livestock barns. These were meant for hay, oxen, and the occasional traveling goose, not for minor nobility with an allergy to straw. But necessity tends to wear down dignity, and before long, the barns were cleared, swept, and very lightly perfumed with crushed lavender in a gesture that fooled absolutely no one. People laid out cloaks, bundled into corners, and argued about who got the driest patch of ground. There were whispered alliances, passive-aggressive seat shuffling, and at least one incident involving a merchant from Ravon who snored so loudly he was exiled to the goat pen for the remainder of the week. Now, this may all sound like an exaggeration, but I promise, it wasn't unusual. In fact, at the 1299 wedding of Margaret of France to Edward I of England, guests were so numerous that tents had to be pitched along the Thames, and entire villages were reportedly politely evacuated to make room for noble lodgings. Contemporary letters describe nobles complaining about the smell of river mud and the lack of wine in their breakfast stews, an absolute catastrophe, clearly. It wasn't uncommon for royal weddings to spill into the surrounding countryside. And comfortable was a relative term. If you had a blanket and didn't wake up wet, you were winning. The nobles pretended this was rustic charm. The merchants called it a networking opportunity. The peasants, wisely, kept their heads down and hoped someone would forget to count the leftovers. So where were Iselda and Aldrich in all this? Well, that depends on how you define involved. Prince Aldrich, to his credit, was aware that guests were arriving in droves. He even held a brief meeting with the steward and the quartermaster, during which he reportedly nodded several times and said, "Do your best." After which he retired to his writing desk to continue drafting a letter to his falcon trainer about a new glove design. His primary concern was not the barn. It was whether the Ravenese diplomat would be seated too close to the wine, a disaster waiting to happen based on a deeply embarrassing incident the year before involving sour mead and a broken lute. As for Iselda, she knew even less. She was not told who was arriving, or how many had come. She did not see the barns. She did not know that her distant cousin was sleeping on a pile of turnip sacks while being serenaded by the court minstrel's understudy. She only knew that the halls grew louder, the nights longer, and that her walking path through the gardens was suddenly lined with unfamiliar faces who bowed awkwardly and said her name wrong. She was told not to worry about the sleeping arrangements. She was the bride. Her job was to smile, gracefully, and walk the aisle without tripping. So while she sat in silence, being fitted for a third pair of gloves she didn't ask for, her guests, some of whom had traveled for weeks, were spooning lentil stew into makeshift bowls and using each other's cloaks as pillows. There is a very particular kind of madness that happens when a wedding dress becomes a group project. You've probably seen it. A bride who just wanted something simple ends up buried beneath 6 layers of tulle and 37 opinions, none of which were hers. Somewhere between the first Pinterest board and the final fitting, the dress stops being an outfit and starts being a public monument, to family, tradition, status, and everyone's unspoken anxiety about how the day should look. This was very much the case for Iselda. Except instead of a Pinterest board, she had a panel of foreign tailors. Instead of family input, she had 3 kingdoms worth of heraldic advisors. And instead of saying she wanted a square neckline and short sleeves, she was told, very gently, by 3 older women with alarming posture, that the fabric had already been ordered, and no, it couldn't be changed, because the Archbishop had already approved the embroidery pattern. The dress was commissioned before she'd even met Aldrich. Before the seating chart. Before anyone had asked whether she preferred green or blue. The gown was decided long before the bride was. And once the process began, it became unstoppable. The outer layers were woven silk imported from Cairo, routed through Venice, taxed twice at the port, and stored in the castle cellar for 2 months before anyone even opened it. When they did, it was damp, slightly crumpled, and still cost more than a stone cottage with a thatched roof. But it shimmered, and shimmer was what mattered. The underlayers were lined with Montreve linen, which, diplomatically, was meant to represent the bride's roots, though in reality it was selected because it arrived early and didn't smell too strongly of sheep. The embroidery, however, is where things got out of hand. The seamstresses, 3 of them, working 12 hours a day by candlelight, were tasked with stitching the crests of both houses into the hem, the cuffs, and the train. The result was a complicated snarl of lions, crescents, oak leaves, and what may have once been a unicorn but now looked more like an exhausted horse lying down. The dyes came from crushed beetles. Yes, beetles. Cochineal, imported in tiny bags, ground by hand, boiled, and strained through cloth until the right tone of diplomatic burgundy emerged. If you've ever cried over the cost of a custom bridesmaid dress, just imagine explaining to your father that your hemline is worth 3 jars of beetle blood and the silk labor of 6 villages. There was no dress rehearsal. There were no second options. There was one design, one destiny, and one unfortunate seamstress who pricked her finger on a pearl clasp and promptly fainted into a basket of embroidery floss. She recovered. The pearl did not. And yet, despite all of this, the most important thing to understand is that Iselda had no say in any of it. She was asked, once, very early in the process, if she had a preference for veil length. She said she didn't mind. The court chamberlain interpreted that as absolute deference, and promptly ordered the longest veil in 3 kingdoms. When it arrived, it required 2 attendants just to lift the end, which created an entirely new conversation about whether she could kneel during the blessing without causing a civic accident. The shoes, wooden-soled, silk-covered, and slightly uneven, were carved to match the color of the archway flowers. Iselda never saw them beforehand. When she finally tried them on, she walked with a subtle but consistent lean, like a particularly regal tree in a strong breeze. The whole ensemble, from veil to slipper, weighed about 20 pounds. That's not poetic exaggeration. That's the actual weight recorded by the scribe, who, to be fair, only wrote it down because the dress cracked a floor tile during the second fitting. And if you're picturing a snow-white gown trailing behind her, soft and pristine like a bridal cloud, let's pause for a moment. Because white, as a wedding color, didn't become fashionable until the 19th century. Specifically, 1840, when Queen Victoria of England wore a white silk satin dress to marry Prince Albert. She wanted to highlight the delicate lace, not start a trend, but society, of course, decided otherwise. Before that, brides wore whatever color suited their station, their household dye budget, or, in Iselda's case, their political strategy. Her gown was a deep, opulent blend of burgundy, gold, and moss green, each tone carefully selected to symbolize alliance, fertility, and the noble houses involved. The result looked, from a distance, like a very expensive tapestry had learned to walk. White, in fact, would have been wildly impractical in a medieval castle. Imagine walking across unpaved stone floors, through unwashed courtyards, past livestock and musicians and diplomats with dripping goblets, in white linen. It would have taken less than 5 minutes to become an embroidered tablecloth of mud and wine stains. So no, not white. Not pure. Not delicate in the way modern magazines promise you'll feel. Iselda's dress wasn't designed to make her look bridal. It was designed to make her look useful. Modern brides worry about backless designs, whether their dress will wrinkle in the car, or whether it'll make their arms look weird in photos. Iselda worried about balance. Gravity. Whether she'd be able to reach the altar without needing a nap halfway through. And unlike today's brides, who might steal a breath of fresh air in a hallway or sneak a snack before the reception, she wasn't allowed to eat for 6 hours before the ceremony. Not because of nerves, but because the waistline was laced so tightly they feared she might faint into the bishop's lap. When the day came, the dress was stunning. People gasped. Someone clutched a handkerchief. 2 elderly noblewomen compared the stitch count to their own wedding garments and quietly agreed that standards had declined. The priest said the hem glowed with divine dignity, and the baker's apprentice described it as the shiniest thing I've ever seen except lightning. One guest described her as a vision of peace. Another as a diplomatic triumph in human form. A third said she looked a bit like a beautifully wrapped gift someone forgot to open. And still, through all this, through the glitter, the praise, the astonished sighs, no one looked closely enough to notice that the bride wasn't smiling. Not with her mouth. Not with her eyes. Because it's hard to smile when your ribs are being cinched into international symbolism and your shoes don't quite match your feet. Iselda said nothing. She stood as she was told, walked when the music played, and sat only when permitted. The weight of the dress pulled at her shoulders. The veil kept slipping to one side. She blinked more than once, a small act of rebellion, really, and was later told by a lady-in-waiting that it may have been misinterpreted as excessive emotion. That night, the dress was carefully removed, folded by gloved hands, and stored in a cedar-lined chest. A monk blessed it. A scribe catalogued it. One chambermaid cried when she saw it, though it's unclear whether from admiration or sheer exhaustion. Iselda, alone, went to bed without speaking. She wasn't asked how the dress made her feel. Only whether she had sweated through the bodice, so they could clean it properly. It was worn once. For one day. And remembered by everyone except the woman who had to carry it. Now let's talk about the ceremony where everyone looked at the bride and future queen, and no one saw her. The wedding took place in the great chapel of Norwald Castle, a stone-walled chamber that had once been used as a fortress keep, then a wine cellar, and finally, after some sacred renovations, a holy site approved by 3 bishops and a rather intense committee of heralds. It was large, drafty, and cold enough that half the guests kept their gloves on through the entire ceremony. The stone floor had been covered with imported rushes and a few half-hearted tapestries depicting various biblical scenes, most of which looked suspiciously like they'd been borrowed from the royal dining hall, because at least 2 angels were holding what appeared to be bread rolls. But the windows were tall and beautiful, and the light that streamed in just before midday, when the ceremony began, made everything feel, at least for a moment, golden. The bride was not permitted to enter from the front. She waited behind a curtain at the back of the chapel, flanked by 2 attendants who whispered contradictory instructions about posture, hand placement, and what to do with the eyes. There was music, soft, rhythmic, lute-heavy, and a rustling among the guests as they rose, adjusted their cloaks, and tried to catch a better view. Someone coughed. Someone sneezed. A diplomat's daughter dropped a velvet glove and was too afraid to pick it up. And then the curtain was drawn back, and there she was. Iselda. Not radiant. Not joyful. But precise. She walked with the practiced pace of someone who had been taught to move the way paintings look, slow, serene, and heavy with symbolic meaning. Her train followed behind her like a royal shadow, pulled slightly to the left by a breeze no one could feel. Her shoes made a sound like patience. And her face, well, her face did what it had been told. It did not tremble, it did not smile, it did not reveal. The ceremony lasted just under 20 minutes, which, for the time, was impressively short. Most noble weddings in the 14th century were less about the blessing itself and more about the staging, the procession, the witnesses, the readings, the exchange of gifts. In many cases, the actual vow was just a handful of Latin words spoken under supervision, followed by a ring of uncertain origin and a forced kiss in front of a deeply uncomfortable monk. But this one, in true Norwald fashion, was efficient. The priest, elderly, slightly wheezy, and wearing a cope trimmed with too many bells, delivered his lines as if reading from a checklist. The groom said his part. The bride nodded. Aldrich, the groom, the heir, the handsome political solution, barely looked at her. He stood tall, as he'd been trained to do, with one hand on the hilt of his ceremonial sword and the other clutching the scroll with his vows, though he didn't need it. He knew his lines. He had practiced. He was, by all accounts, ready. But when their eyes met, just briefly, during the priest's invocation, there was nothing. No smile. No nod of reassurance. Not even a flicker of recognition. It wasn't cruelty. It was pure detachment. He had been raised for this moment just as she had, told whom to marry, what to say, and how to hold his chin. He was not unkind. He was simply, already somewhere else. And in that silence between them, the hush of unspoken questions, of a life about to begin without introductions, Iselda realized something. This ceremony was the most attention they would likely ever receive at the same time. And yet, in all of it, there had been no conversation. No shared glance of "can you believe this?" No whispered joke, no cold fingers brushing in nervous solidarity. They were the main characters in a play with no rehearsal. And neither of them had written the script. And when the bishop gestured for them to clasp hands, Iselda offered hers like someone donating a glove. There were no personal vows. No speeches. No friends standing beside her, no sister crying in the second pew. There was, however, a misplaced dove that fluttered down from the rafters and landed squarely on the bishop's head during the final blessing. The guests took it as a good omen. The bishop took it as a moment of personal trial. What followed was not a reception, as we would think of it today. There were no dances, no toasts, no wildly inappropriate uncle with a wine goblet and unsolicited life advice. Instead, medieval wedding celebrations unfolded in phases, over hours, and sometimes days. First came the ceremonial walk through the castle grounds, where the newlyweds were expected to be seen, to be admired, to physically embody the idea of unity, walking side by side while people whispered about the quality of the embroidery and whether the groom looked too pale. Then came the hand-washing ritual. A symbolic cleansing of the past, which, depending on the kingdom, involved holy water, scented oils, or, in one famously disastrous wedding, raw eggs. Then the feast, which we'll get to in the next segment. And finally, the most awkward part of all, the bedding ceremony. Now, to be clear, not every royal wedding included a public escort to the bedchamber. That depended on region, religion, and just how badly the family wanted to prove the marriage was consummated. But it was not uncommon, especially in politically sensitive unions, for the bride and groom to be paraded into their bedchamber by a group of elders, undressed to a symbolic minimum, and then tucked in with gentle applause. Thankfully, Iselda was spared that particular horror. Instead, she was escorted quietly to her new quarters, where she sat for several minutes in complete silence while her attendants picked straw out of her train and a steward announced the wine list for the evening. She did not drink the wine. She did not ask for music. She simply removed her shoes, pressed her fingers against the embroidered lines on her gown, and waited for someone to tell her what came next. It's difficult, sometimes, to describe how much this day wasn't about her. Modern weddings, for all their pressures and Pinterest anxiety, are often shaped by the bride. Their love stories wrapped in fabric and florals, driven by taste and choice. Women today may still face ridiculous expectations, but at least they can pick the shoes. They can speak their vows. They can say yes, or no, to the dress, the music, the guest list, and the man. Iselda couldn't pick anything. Not even the name she'd be remembered by. And so, when she walked down that long stone aisle, flanked by statues and staring eyes, she wasn't entering a new life. She was being absorbed into a narrative someone else had written. Her smile, if you could call it that, was the last thing anyone saw before the feast began. And by the time the soup had gone cold and the banners began to wilt, most guests had already forgotten what color her eyes were. It took nearly 6 months to plan the feast. Not the ceremony. Not the marriage contract. Not the guest quarters or the choir or the blessings or the florals. No, the feast was the true centerpiece. And it had to be unforgettable. At least, for everyone else. The menu alone required 3 scribes, 2 interpreters, and a royal food astrologer. Yes, that was a real position, who was consulted to ensure the planetary alignment wouldn't cause indigestion or, heaven forbid, marital discord. 12 courses were served. 7 animals were roasted whole. 2 fountains poured spiced wine. And 1 unfortunate swan was dyed gold and then filled with smaller birds, which sounds magical until you remember someone had to clean that up afterward. The kitchens of Norwald Castle were not equipped for this scale of madness. Cooks were imported from the coast. Extra ovens were built using leftover castle stones. A butcher's apprentice sprained his wrist chopping eels. A local herbalist fainted into a vat of marzipan after arguing that rose water should never be used on pears, and honestly, history may be on her side. Food was prestige. It was diplomacy on a platter. You didn't just feed your guests, you impressed them, and then made sure they told everyone back home. And where was the bride in all of this? Tucked away at the high table, naturally. Silent. Smiling. Sitting on a cushion stuffed with goose feathers, positioned so her new in-laws could see her best angle. Iselda was served before everyone else, a sign of status, but it also meant she was done eating while the soup was still halfway down the main aisle. She was given the choicest cuts of meat, 3 kinds of bread, and a special imported citrus that was rumored to boost fertility. No one asked if she liked citrus. Meanwhile, the groom, seated beside her, spent most of the evening talking to a noblewoman from Valar about military fortifications and barley yields. Iselda, for her part, listened politely and drank just enough diluted wine to keep her expression pleasant without risking any actual warmth. Not once, all evening, did anyone ask how she was feeling. Not her new mother-in-law. Not the steward. Not even the lady's maid who adjusted her veil between courses. because she wasn't the hostess. She was the centerpiece. Meanwhile, in the lower hall, because of course there was a lower hall, over 200 guests were eating off wooden boards, balancing flagons of ale on borrowed stools, and pretending they didn't notice the dogs sneaking under the tables. These were the lesser nobles, the minor merchants, the random cousins who had traveled 5 days just to be put in a hayloft and served cold pheasant in a crust that was mostly symbolic. Some of them never saw the bride. Many of them couldn't hear the music over the clatter of trenches. One guest described the evening as a glorious triumph of meat, while another simply wrote, "I saw a rat. He was majestic." No one complained. Because even being in the room, even being on the castle grounds during a royal wedding, was enough to elevate your family status for a generation. Who cared if the wine was sour or the soup arrived late? You were there. That was what mattered. Modern weddings have their own problems, of course. The cake never arrives on time. The cousin forgets the rings. The DJ mispronounces the couple's names. And there's always someone who says, "This is nice, but I liked Sarah's wedding more." But modern brides also get to choose things. Their playlist. Their shoes. Their guests. Even their husband, ideally. Iselda had none of that. She didn't get to plan the menu or pick the flowers or veto the stilt walker someone suggested for entertainment. She couldn't even sit back and enjoy a piece of bread without being offered a third goblet of symbolic wine and a prayer in Latin she wasn't allowed to repeat. The feast was magnificent. The guests were dazzled. The kingdom was pleased. And the bride? She watched the roasted boar roll by, like a parade float she hadn't bought tickets to. She clinked glasses with people who didn't know her name. She smiled at diplomats who had bet against the marriage in court. And when her fourth course was cleared away, she realized, this was probably the most food she'd ever be allowed to eat in public again. When the final goblet was drained, when the lutes grew quiet, and when the servants began scraping marrow bones off the stone floor, someone, no one remembers exactly who, lifted their glass and said, simply, to the Queen. It wasn't planned. It wasn't official. The coronation would come later, with a bishop, a relic, and 3 different crowns. But in that moment, in the candlelight haze of roasted goose smoke and diplomatic smugness, the word Queen floated through the air like incense. People repeated it. Toasted it. Some even bowed slightly as she passed. Not because she had done anything. Not because she had said anything. But because she had survived the evening without fainting, crying, or causing an incident, and apparently, that was enough to qualify. She was led back to her new chambers by 2 women she hadn't met that morning, both of whom called her Your Grace with the brittle enthusiasm of people who had rehearsed the line for weeks. The room was beautiful. Tall windows. A carved bed frame. A fireplace that had been lit 6 hours too early and now smoked gently, as if embarrassed to still be going. The sheets had been changed. The pitcher of wine refilled. A small gift sat on the vanity, a brooch shaped like a lion with the teeth filed down. There was no note. Iselda removed her earrings. Her gloves. The embroidered underskirt that had been stitched with exactly 137 pearls, 2 of which had come loose and were now probably somewhere between the dining hall and history. She looked at herself in the mirror and did something dangerous. She whispered her own name. Not Your Grace. Not my lady. Just Iselda. Quietly. Once. As if reminding the room, and perhaps herself, that there was still someone underneath the title. Someone who had once run through the grape fields with dirty ankles and a braid that always unraveled. Someone who liked apricots. Someone who had imagined her wedding day as something different. The groom arrived late. Aldrich, her new husband, her royal counterpart, the man she was now expected to support, advise, produce heirs for, and occasionally pretend to laugh at, entered the room carrying a goblet of wine and a facial expression that could best be described as politely exhausted. He bowed. She curtsied. They exchanged 3 sentences about the feast. He asked if she liked her rooms. She said yes. He did not ask if she liked him. There was a moment, a soft, hanging pause, where something human might have happened. A question. A joke. A sigh of shared awkwardness. But nothing did. Because this wasn't about them as people. It was about the role they now played. He was the heir. She was the crown's alliance. And so, in a chamber that smelled faintly of cedar, violets, and cooked swan, Iselda went to bed beside a man she barely knew, under a banner with his family's crest, in a bed that had been slept in by 3 queens before her, 2 of whom had died, 1 of whom had simply disappeared. She didn't cry. She didn't sleep. She just lay there, listening to the castle settle around her. The footsteps. The wind. The distant laughter still echoing from the guest hall. And when morning came, and the chambermaid entered with breakfast and a scroll of appointments, she addressed her, for the first time, not as a guest or a bride, but as Her Majesty. So the day ended. The guests returned to their chambers, or their hay piles, or their wagons parked 2 fields away. The kitchens fell silent. The candles guttered out. The banners, soaked in wine and ash and praise, were folded up for safekeeping. And somewhere, in the long corridor between celebration and obligation, a girl became a queen, without ever quite becoming a bride. History doesn't say much about Iselda. There are records, yes, treaties signed, births recorded, visits noted. But nothing personal. No letters. No portrait that bears her name. No diary or legacy or moment where someone, somewhere, asked, did she ever smile? Because history, as you may have noticed, has never been terribly interested in how women felt. It remembers what they wore. How many children they brought to the world. What they broke or preserved or represented. But how they slept. Whether they were lonely. Whether they whispered their old name into a pillow before drifting off. That part is missing. Which is why we're here. To imagine what the history books never pause to ask. To sit beside the silenced. To fill in the quiet spaces. So, if you're still awake, thank you for keeping her company. And if you're already asleep, may your dreams be softer than her wedding bed. Until next time, sleep well.